So today we're going to talk about how these groups got started, the things that they hold in common, as well as what separates them. Because curiously enough, they started in about the same time period, but today they've ended up in such very, very different places. So let's get started. It was the year 1525. Protestant Reformation. I'm going to try to use the laser here and not blind anybody. These boundaries were constantly changing. All of Europe was in upheaval. And there is a little place, the Netherlands. You can tell the boundaries have changed from back then. But in the Netherlands was a man named Menno Simons. And he was a Catholic priest. And after studying scripture, he believed very strongly that there was a problem in how baptism occurred, and he believed in what was called a believer's baptism or adult baptism, which versus infant baptism, which had been done for thousands of years. Now that probably seems like a small point to us in this day and age, but at the time it was civil anarchy. And you know why? Because you always want to follow the money. Infant baptism was part of church records, which was part of government records, which was part of taxation. So this little group was called the Anabaptists. Menno Simons there, you can see the time frame. And I'm going to keep this slide up for a minute because I need to refer back to this fellow on the right. But for now we're looking at Menno Simons on the left. These Anabaptists were given a disparaging term. Anabaptist means to be baptized again, and at the time it was sort of a mockery of a term. They were persecuted, they were martyred, burned at the stake, their goods were confiscated. They were chased across Europe and ended up, in fact I'll go back, ended up in parts of Alsace, France, and Germany and Switzerland, places that nobody could farm, because they were so high up in the mountains, but they figured it out. And it almost seems to be part of the DNA of the Anabaptists to know how to farm well, because that continues today. But despite persecution, they grew and grew and grew in little small house churches. The first group that grew out of that movement was called the Mennonites, after Menno Simons.
That makes sense now.
Yeah. That was the first group, so just keep that in mind as we talk. And as they grew, they weren't organized. It wasn't like there was a hierarchy at this point. These were little church houses trying to stay hidden from the police that were almost reminiscent a little bit. They were actually Anabaptist hunters, like bounty hunters. Almost reminds me of Nazi Germany in a way, because they were the underground. But as I said, it grew and grew and grew. And with it came a cardinal value of simplicity, of simple living. There's other groups that you might recognize, the Hutterites, Jacob Hutter in 1527. And the Hutterites are today, they believed in communal living, so-called communalism. Today they're considered one of the finest groups of communal living in the world. They're in North Dakota, South Dakota, they're in the Canada region. They had been chased across Europe. I wish I'd thought of a slide to bring, but little polka dot kerchiefs, if that rings a bell. You probably recognize them. Other groups are the Old Order German Baptists. That was my grandfather, also called the Dunkards. The River Brethren, the Apostolic Church, on and on. And somehow they kept growing. So some were pacifists, some were not. It wasn't, like I mentioned, it wasn't like there was a hierarchy amongst all these little factions, but again, think of the Anabaptists almost like a tree, and these little groups are growing out of that. Persecution continued all through the 1500s, very severely. Now, it wasn't until Jacob Ammon, this fellow on the right, came up in 1693, so 150 plus years later. Jacob Ammon, he was, I think, a rather belligerent man. He was of the Mennonites. He did not believe that the Mennonites went far enough with church discipline. He introduced shunning. Jacob Ammon is the first one to introduce that. The Amish come from Ammon. I don't have his death because nobody knows what happened to him. He kind of vanished, and you can see why at the way persecution was going. Anyway, I'd like you to, if nothing else you remember today about the Amish, do remember that only the Amish shun, and it is part of church discipline. So, moving on, the Amish were the last of the party. They were the last of the Anabaptists to form, though they're probably the most recognizable today of the groups. Okay, now we're going to switch bonnets, and we're going to the Quakers and where they got started. This is in England. Very, very different beginnings. About a century after the start of the Anabaptists, the Quaker religious movement began in England in the aftermath of the English Civil War. There was a civil war that went on for probably 9+ years, and as we all know about wars, just because it's over doesn't mean it's over. So this was the world that George Fox was born into. Born in 1624, this was the world he knew was just upheaval. His father was named Christopher Fox. He was a weaver, a very successful weaver in a strongly Puritan town. Young George was said to be quite a serious boy, though very learned, though there's no record of any schooling that he had, no official schooling. He was always drawn, even as a small boy, to the pursuit of simplicity and humility and the abandonment of luxury. Everyone in his family expected him to be a minister because he just had such a contemplative nature. But he was very disturbed by the hypocrisy of paid clergy among the Puritans. As he saw it, they worshiped so diligently on Sunday, and then it disappeared on Monday through Saturday. When he was 19, he left his job as an apprentice to a shoemaker, and he just began wandering the country in search of a new faith. You can see what a serious little fellow he was. And in a series of visions, he sensed an inner voice guiding him to a new way of perceiving God. In his thinking, every single person contained a divine spark, a glimmer of the light of Christ. And it wasn't long before he had really developed the genesis of what became Quakerism. This is, again, a very broad brush, but if there are two things about Quakerism that you want to remember, it's that every individual has direct and personal access to the light and love of God, every individual without an intermediary, and no longer was society divided between priests and people. Again, radical thinking at that time. So it's been said that they were first called Quakers because they sort of trembled during their meetings, but George Fox disagrees. He maintains that it occurred when he was arrested by a magistrate, had to go before a magistrate named Bennett, and George Fox, in characteristic bluntness, told his accusers that they had to tremble at the word of God. And this magistrate, Judge Bennett, then gave him the name of Quakers. And that's how Quaker came about. So persecution is continuing through England. It's now, just to give a quick, flash through, King Charles was executed. Oliver Cromwell was leading the Commonwealth. Persecution of the Quakers continued. Cromwell was somewhat sympathetic to the Quakers. They were growing. Again, the mystery of persecution. But even though Cromwell was somewhat sympathetic to the Quakers, and especially fond of George Fox, they could not prevent them from suffering terrible persecution. The monarchy was restored in 1660 with King Charles II. But during both the eras of Cromwell and Charles, the Quakers were mobbed and flogged and driven from meeting houses and imprisoned. George Fox was in prison many times. Nevertheless, they kept growing. Fox's followers were known as children of light, as publishers of truth, of friends of truth, before it kind of came in for a landing at the Society of Friends. George Fox, he's still, in our minds, he's still alive at this point, but I wanted just to show, he was really badly hurt with, in his body, took a lot of beating, but he was interested in getting to the New World, and he did in 1671. He came to the New World. English persecutions were so severe, and friends started looking to other places to live. Many went over to Europe, to the Netherlands as well. In Also going on in Europe at this time, the Amish persecution had lessened, but they could not own their own land. They could farm, but they could not own. So everyone started looking toward the New World. And enter William Penn. William Penn was a Quaker by what they called convincement, which means he was converted. That was the term they used. King Charles II had owed his father a huge debt, and in lieu of monetary reimbursement, he gave him just this big chunk of land over in the New World, which we all know of now as Penn's Woods or Pennsylvania. And Penn went to this New World with the idea of the holy experiment. He took his Quaker idealism and built it into this land that would be all could worship in freedom. Now I'm going to switch over a little bit to the Amish. They were aware of Penn's Woods. Penn's lands agents had gone into Germany, Netherlands, to the Palatinate region where many of these people were living, many of the Germans, and sold land to them. This is where my grandfather's ancestors way back had bought land. And the Amish emigrated mainly to Pennsylvania. This is a ship, this is a true story about the Charming Nancy. That's kind of an artist rendition. And it's a merchant ship, it's not a passenger ship. This was in 1737. The first actual group of Old Order Amish came to the New World with a minister, because though there'd been people coming, Mennonites coming, they couldn't marry, bury, or baptize without a minister. So a settlement really couldn't stay intact without one. And for the first time, they had a group coming over in 1737 on this little tugboat. I mean, it's amazing that many didn't make it. Actually, it was a horrific journey. Over half the children died. They were stuck in the lower deck because the upper deck was so dangerous. In the 1800s, they had passenger ships, but not in the 1700s. These were merchant ships that used to go back and forth along from Spain and France and England selling and trading. So it was a terrible experience. I actually wrote a book called Anna's Crossing, and it's about this story of the Old Order Amish coming to America for the first time. But one thing I loved about reading and researching this story is that we all had a cockeyed optimist somewhere in our background. All of us who believed that coming across the ocean was the best place. There was a better world ahead. It's just amazing because half of them died on the trip. It sounded so horrific. I also brought a picture. This is a little bit of a fuzzy picture. I apologize for that. This is all their worldly belongings. All of them would have gone into a trunk like this. Think of that as you are cleaning out your garage next summer. Okay, persecution is continuing. Sadly, in the New World, the Puritans were even less tolerant of the Quakers in New England, not Pennsylvania, but in New England, than the Puritans were in England, and laws were quickly passed against Quakerism. There were no executions in the UK for Quakers, but they were in the New World. And as time went on, they suffered more and more brutalities. They were branded, they had their ears cropped, they were flogged from town to town. Women were sometimes stripped naked and put in the stocks. Somehow they continued to grow, such a mystery of persecution. But as these two faiths became grounded in the New World, their theology and their lifestyle became very defined. So there are differences in their theologies, though they are both rooted in a Protestant faith. The Amish hope for salvation, but they don't have the assurance of salvation, like modern evangelicals would believe. The Quakers did not have much concern for heaven or hell. The Amish have a great sense of humility and awareness of sin. Quakers have humility but rarely spoke of sin. The Quakers stress Jesus Christ's ministry rather than his divinity. The Amish focus very much on Christ's holiness and divinity. Again, very broad brush. That's like a flyover view of them. There's so many different factions within, but I wanted to give you just sort of a basic idea. Another similarity, policy of non-resistance. Now, the Old Order Amish were not consistently pacifists until probably the 1900s, but it's now very much a cardinal value among them. And obviously the Quakers are militant pacifists, refusing to take arms. Now, the refusal to fight has put both groups at odds with the states, especially during our 2 world wars, raising doubts as to their patriotism. On a side note, for those of you who might know of Midwestern towns, during World War I, the towns of, now pronounced Berlin, Wisconsin, Berlin, Ohio, actually changed their pronunciation. They used to be Berlin, but they changed it during World War I to distance themselves from Germany. Okay, their work ethic, their frugality, their humility. As for work ethic, both groups, Quakers and the Amish, are so known for hard work, for thriftiness, for an emphasis on humility. They both refuse to swear oaths. That's because of a verse in Matthew, the book of Matthew in the Bible. Instead, they speak only the truth. They kept their word. A handshake to this day is an Amish contract. The Quakers refused to barter. You know about the stories of the Quaker syndicates here and those the investors of the whaling ships. They gained reputation as honest traders. Here's something you might remember as for the quality of their work. Do you remember these? They were in the Sunday paper a few years ago. I don't know if they still are. Amish heaters made in China. What's amusing is that the Amish have created a brand without even trying to. So another example of humility among the Amish is that in their church services, they sing without harmony. They sing with one voice because no one should stand out. There are no instruments in an Amish church as well. Both Quakers and Amish don't use formal titles such as Mr. and Mrs. The Quaker speech years ago used to use the personal pronouns thee and thy and thou, which sounds so formal to us now, but at the time that was actually less formal. So another cardinal value is this simple living. And a testimony to their living was their clothing. So when the Amish first came to Pennsylvania in the 1700s, their clothing was peasant clothing from Germany. They didn't use the buttons and things like that because that was a reaction to the excess of nobility. Clothing at that time was almost like our modern wedding dresses with buttons all the way down. So that was the reason they didn't want the buttons. But they adopted the big black coal scuttle bonnet from the Quakers. And the simple clothing as well, the somewhat somber clothing. Now, and that is George Fox with sort of that flat-brimmed hat. And as they progressed, the Quakers wore silk and wool, not cotton, because that would have been a product of slaves. But I'm going to advance now and show you, these are some Lancaster Amish. Notice the prayer caps, but also notice just the vibrant clothing, almost like jewels. You'll never see red among the Amish because that would be the color of a harlot. But, they do have, just their own distinct style. I don't want to go too fast here, but I want to show you. So this is the variety of clothing among the older Amish. I'm going to go back one. These are prayer caps and the men's hats, and they are different for all over. You're not going to find one size fits all Amish. This next one is a Lancaster prayer cap, and it's this heart-shaped, very distinctive. It's one of my favorites. I was actually up in Maine a few weeks ago on Cadillac Mountain, and there was a group of Amish. This is one thing I love about them because they always pop up in places you wouldn't expect, and I knew who they were because of their prayer caps. Here we go with other areas. I'm going to show you. Some of them remind me, this next one reminds me of a nurse's cap almost. That's an Ohio, stiff, very firm. Okay, back on track. Okay, no photographs. They have differing reasons, and this would be historically for the Quakers. They felt that a full-face likeness was considered sinful vanity, so they did allow silhouettes, these stark black profiles against a white background. And notice her prayer cap as well. Prayer caps are not just unique to these groups. That was part of a verse in the Bible in which women should have their hair covered. So it was common. I grew up, do you remember Catholics when you were, yeah, it's not an unusual thing. So the reason the Amish, though, do not allow, for photography is because of a verse in the Bible about avoiding being a graven image. Though some will even disagree and say we really don't know where it came from, but that's our policy. And it's only for baptized adults. Children actually can be photographed because they're not baptized yet. They're not truly Amish. They're born Amish, an Amish family, but they're not Amish until they actually become baptized as an adult, and we call bend the knee. Okay, another part of their humility is we're going to see these plain graves, another testimony. It was considered vain to mark one graves with a headstone. I was just out here yesterday to see the Quaker cemetery. I think the only graves there were the factions that started developing later on, but not originally. Amish cemeteries have very small gravestones. No one stands out. I'm going to go through a couple. They're almost like a military, just row. This one I thought was particularly poignant, little stillborn twins. This is a fun similarity between the Quaker and the Amish, and it's proverbs and sayings. Now, the Amish speak Pen Dutch, which is an oral language. It comes from the Palatinate region. They all speak it. It's their first language. It is a dialect of true German. I know it's bothering you. To me, it's a little bit like looking, if you know German, it's like looking in a circus mirror. I have a friend named Esther. We would think Smucker, like Smucker's jelly, but it's pronounced Smooker. So everything's just a little bit off. But they are so rich. I grew up on these with my mom. Time brings wounds and heals them. What will become of the sheep if the wolf is the judge? Silence is the fence around wisdom. I want to point out, this is a picture I took in Gap, Pennsylvania. It's a phone shanty. Very common sight. It almost looks like an outhouse, but it's not. And you'll see a lane among the Amish, maybe 3 or 4 farmhouses that will have a little phone shanty, and they share a message machine, and they'll get their messages once or twice a day. One thing, when the phone became common in the 20s and the 30s, even though there's not a hierarchy of the Amish, the bishops do gather together, and they'll talk about some of the things that are concerning them and facing their churches. And at that time, they decided that they thought a telephone might interrupt family life. So with that, to this day, phones are outside of the house. This is the Budget, and it's an Amish Mennonite newspaper. This is in Sugar Creek, Ohio. It is such an interesting picture of the Amish life today. So the Budget is, I think, one of the, I do try to read it. It's not easy reading. Every single person, every church, 2,400 churches in America, in North America, will have a scribe, and they will send in a weekly letter that is published. So it is just the news that relates to their community. But think about how that is binding community, how that is just holding together and keeping them distinctive. At the end of each scribe's letter, they often will put a little Pen Dutch proverb. Now the Quakers have all kinds of wonderful sayings too, even though they're a highly literate society. They have wonderful sayings. This is probably the most famous one. Let your life speak. Don't speak unless you can improve the silence. Notice a theme. You can see these proverbs are passing on values. They're sort of just infusing a child with values. This is one my mother said often. Everyone is crazy but me and thee, and sometimes I wonder about thee. And then William Penn is a treasure trove of sayings. He's very quotable. The knowledge is the treasure of a wise man. This one I think is so good. The quieter you become, the more you can hear. So that is the part of this talk on what similarities they have. And now I'm going to shift over and talk about what separates them. Here is one of the biggest differences between the two groups. The Quakers aimed to be in the world but not of it. Many were activists and are activists who address serious social reform. The Amish separate from the world. They isolate. They live in rural areas. Tourism is changing that, creating pressures on them. Lancaster is one of the top tourist destinations in our country. But for the most part, they are seeking out more rural places. In fact, they're moving all over to, I think, 37 states now have Amish settlements. The Amish live off the grid. If you notice in this, no wires connected to that house. See that? No wires. Clothesline low. If you are traveling through Amish country, this is one of the best ways to see if it's an Amish thing. I want to point out one thing in this house, this picture. This was, you see all those buggies there? This was one of those ministers' meetings that they will have now and then, but they will, where they do discuss different things. But it's just a beautiful sight so even though they live off the grid, you might be surprised to know that they have solar panels, solar cells, battery packs, propane, kerosene lanterns, LED flashlights, windmills, and of course the clothesline. I just love the pictures of the clotheslines. They're everywhere, flapping in the wind, every day but Sunday, and they're like colors of jewel because the Amish have no patterns in their clothing. It's just going to be a solid colors. Okay, another big way that the Amish, they hold fast to traditions. It doesn't mean they don't make changes, but they hold tight. And when you think of that as a key way that they are avoiding assimilation into a culture, here is one of the biggest ways. The horse and the buggy has to do with keeping the community close. Let's go back to almost like the telephone in the 20s and the 30s when the automobiles were starting to become part of mainstream. They made a decision that a horse could only travel about 15 miles, and that would keep their community tight. Now, what's interesting, that's a black top. There's a gray top buggy. There's all different kinds of buggies that, if you know the Amish well, can almost tell you what group you're looking at. This is a Swarzentrooper, which is one of the most conservative. Doesn't look safe at all, does it? And I've been in these. And when you have a truck rumbling by you, it is scary. Another gray top wagon. These horses they are actually thoroughbreds or standardbreds off the racetrack. They trot down so beautiful. He doesn't look happy, but they normally look very, very happy. Okay, this is something else. This is typical of Lancaster, not Ohio or Indiana, but it's a scooter. Do you see no pedals? This is another decision they made, that a bicycle took someone too far away, so they kept you close. You can start seeing a theme develop among the Amish. Keep that family close. And you'll see grandmothers with children on them scootering all around the country roads. They go pretty fast. They're surprising. Another, they are farmer plowing his field with horses. Here's a boy plowing with mules. And this is corn shocks, which is a lost art of a means to dry corn. But it's a beautiful, I took that picture in Ohio. Okay, another big difference. Men and women are considered equal among the Quakers. It was a standard set by Mary Coffin Starbuck, who adopted the Quaker faith back in 1701 or 1702. She was one of the very first settlers. After studying her life, I have a hunch that this might have been something that swayed her to Quakerism, because she was such a unique woman. I'm just so impressed by her. It's the reason I really wrote the books. I just find her to be an amazing woman. She was called Great Mary, or likened to the Deborah of the Old Testament. But how a woman rose in a man's world to have the respect that she did, I think is just remarkable. Such a radical concept in the 1700s for a woman to even work outside of the home, but she set the tone for Nantucket. Some other people who have made such a significant difference. This is Elizabeth Fry. She was an English prison reformer in the first half of the 1800s. Awesome prayer. She was called the Angel of Prisons. Imagine saying this prayer every morning. "Oh Lord, may I be directed what to do and what to leave undone." So just a side note, did you know that solitary confinement and even the word penitentiary comes from the Quakers? They had a belief that if criminals could spend time alone with God, reflecting on their ways, they would reform their behavior. Pretty fascinating. So, women in the Amish church, conversely, do not speak in church. They do not hold any leadership position. They have very clear traditional roles, and it is a patriarchal system. But with that said, women do hold great respect among the Amish. They do have companies and have employees working for them. Motherhood is viewed with great reverence. I mentioned my friend Esther Smooker. That's her there. That's me walking alongside. She is one of the most joyful women I know. I just love her. This is her with one of her friends. I have a story about Esther, and this is one of the things about the Amish that I find surprising. So I picked Esther up one day, and one thing I've learned when you travel among Amish and you have Amish friends is that when you have a car, you are now their errand person for the day. So we went out and did a bunch of errands, and then we were back at her house where her daughter had a newborn baby, and just fun to be a part of their life. And then I was going to drop Esther back at her house. Now, this was a couple of years ago, so this was before the elections, of our presidential election 2 years ago. We get in the car, and we buckle up. I'm driving, Esther's in the back seat. She snaps in her seatbelt, and she goes, "So, what about Trump?" And I thought, I don't know. But they're always surprising me. Okay, now another significant difference. The Quakers have no outward form of baptism or Holy Communion. The essence of these concepts were really meant to be inward and were spiritually private and couldn't be reduced to outward displays. By contrast, the baptism, as we've talked about, is what the Amish are all about, very central to their core, as are other sacraments as well. Communion is very significant to them. It happens twice a year, and it's a day of fasting way before it, and then foot washing in the morning, but it's a very central part of their beliefs. Okay, we're moving to the Amish avoid political and social issues. Now, they do provide aid to help in national disasters, like they'll send off helpers during hurricanes or during forest fires, but they work through the Mennonites. Mennonites have a huge organization and a frame and a network for helping. Conversely, the Quakers are so active in social justice. There have been so many influential Quakers who have made their mark and lived with such purposeful lives, starting in the New World with William Penn. Here he's a young boy. There were abolitionists. Levi Coffin, president of the Underground Railroad. It's thought that he and his wife helped over 3,000 slaves escape. That is a coffin. I mean, that's pretty impressive. Lucretia Mott, born on Nantucket, became an abolitionist as well as a social reformer for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony was a Quaker. And here's one I bet you didn't know. Singer Joan Baez. Another major difference among the Quakers and the Amish, Quakers are known for their emphasis on education, especially educating women. Very significant part of who they are. You've probably heard of George Fox University. That's out in Oregon. There's President Obama's children attended a Friends School in Washington, D.C. By contrast, and this is the hardest thing for people to swallow, and I understand it, the Amish end formal schooling at grade 8. They went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1972, Wisconsin versus Yoder, to have this right. And we are a culture that values education. This is a hard thing to grasp. The only thing I ask you to do is try not to put our ideas on another culture, even though they are an American culture. And without really defending them, I have to admit that though their formal education stops at grade 8, their learning never stops. They are some of the most, in fact, I've never been in an Amish home without floor-to-ceiling books. And one of my favorite stories is when I stayed in the home of a man named Daniel. He'd had a dairy farm until his oldest son was 21 and could take it over. And then Daniel taught himself electricity and hires out as an electrician, though he does not use electricity in his home. They're like that. They are just hardworking, German, resourceful people. Here's some slides of some of these one-room schoolhouses that are really quaint when we think this is how our great-grandparents went to school. Most of America was a rural schoolhouse. Little corner. This is an outhouse on a winter day. Imagine that. This is inside. I was privileged to spend a couple days, and I've spent a couple days in different Amish schoolhouses, just observing from the back, and they're just like walking back in time. Colorful and cheerful. This next one is one of my favorites. All these little boys' hats. So orderly. Another difference, the Quakers meet in meeting houses. Their meeting houses are very plain. No steeples, no organs, no pulpits. I'm going to go through some historical ones where you see separate doors for men and women entering. You can see that there and there. Same here, there, and there. The interior is plain. Now, by contrast, the Amish meet in churches for houses to this day. And their houses are designed so that they can open up inside. Almost like this. Let's just say we could open up these doors. And they'll have funerals in the home, they have weddings in the home, and they have church about once or twice a year, depending, everyone takes a turn, which you can imagine how that helps your housekeeping. That would be a pressure. 200 to 300 people in your home. The bench wagon pulls up, and so you can see no lights, no electricity, or no wires, I mean. So anyway, when they can't fit, with bench wagon shows up, and just hard benches, backless benches, almost like this but without any backs, and they will, the church lasts 3 hours or longer. Every 2 weeks they have their church. When they can no longer fit anymore, then they split. And they will have then the lots drawn for another bishop, another ministers, and deacon, and another church forms. Now that they're all standalone churches. So there are so many variations among the different Amish churches, 2,400 churches. You will have, I've actually been on a street like this. One side of the street, cell phones will be permitted for work. Across the side street is another church, and on that they will have no cell phones at all. You'd get in trouble if you used one. And they might have to have refrigerators on the back porch, but no one knows why. But they might be able to use tractors. No one knows why. It's just the way they sort of work. They make decisions for themselves. They're not quite as locked in time as you might think. Okay, I'm going to go through some pictures here of houses. Every Amish house, almost every Amish house, has a children's playground. Children are loved. They're loved but not adored. Okay, here is something that's going to surprise you. Amish are the fastest growing population in North America. Isn't that amazing? Fastest, that doesn't mean they're the biggest, but they're the fastest growing population in North America. In 1900, there were 5,000 Old Order Amish living in the United States. Sociologists assumed they would assimilate into the culture like so many other groups had done. And my latest statistics are 2016. There are over 300,000 Old Order Amish. Old Order Amish. So there's new orders and there's splits from others, but that is amazing. By 2050, projected to be 1 million Old Order Amish. They're growing. Can you guess? How are they growing? Any ideas?
Big families.
Big families. Growing from the inside out. And they have a incredibly high retention rate of about 85 to 90% who will, when they are of age, they will make a decision to stay and join the church. They live primarily in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Indiana. About 2/3 of the population in North America lives there. Okay, by contrast now, the Quakers are declining. There are so many divisions, they've assimilated into the culture, but at one time, 1/3 of colonial America was Quaker. Okay, I looked up statistics just this morning on this. The population of 13 colonies in 1775 was 2.5 million, which means there were about 800,000 Quakers. Today, there are, in the world, my statistics are 2017, in the entire world, there are 380,000 Quakers. That means in the United States, there are about 76,000 because half of the Quakers are elsewhere. Does anyone know where? Africa. Isn't that amazing? It's amazing. Kenya has the largest population of Quakers, about 146,000 Quakers. Remarkable. So, where will these groups be in 100 years? I don't know. It's pretty interesting because they are certainly facing a lot of challenges, but both of them have given us so much. I mean, the Quakers, goodness, democracy, trial by jury, prison reform, caring for mentally ill, abolitionism, women's rights. They are part of our Constitution. They have given so much of this country. I think the Amish have taught us so much about holding tight to community, about family and faith. The barn raising is much more than a metaphor. It is really what they're all about, taking care of each other. I don't know where they'll be in 100 years, but I think they have a lot to teach us in that very thing. They're certainly facing pressures. When you think of what's happening in this world, it's hard for the Amish to keep it shut out. But one thing I think they have a question for us, which is so good, is for all of us to kind of think long and hard about what we can hold on to and what we need to let go of. So with that, my little cow, at the end of the day, now I can open up to questions if you have any. Thanks. How are we doing time? 15 minutes?
12:54. There are a
Perfect.
couple of minutes if anybody
Yeah,
has
if you have any.
questions.
Yes,
I had a question. What did you mean by the old order Amish versus?
the New Order Amish. She had a question about what is Old Order versus New Order. It's a division. So the New Order Amish would have split off from the Old Order at some point, and they would be more liberal. There's almost like a spectrum of Old Order Amish that go from ultra conservative, outdoor plumbing and unpainted houses, almost proud of being poor, all the way up to, and this is just in the Old Order, very liberal progressives that they still would be horse and buggy, but much more open-minded. They're voting. They all pay taxes, by the way. The Amish do pay taxes, even though they're.
Old order, the section on Amish that is growing fast, or is it the new order?
The Old Order Amish are very identifiable because of their distinctive lifestyle. So that's the fastest population growing by percentage, not by numbers necessarily. But and the Mennonites are huge. They're enormous. Yes.
Could you explain again how the term Society of Friends came to be?
The Siding Friends?
Society
Oh, Society of Friends. Okay, yes. He asked about how the term Society of Friends, well, you mean how the Quakers were called, or just
How that came to be?
that they were called the Quakers?
Friends.
Or the Society of Friends?
How the Quakers became known as the Society of Friends?
Okay. So the Quaker term was a disparaging term. It was not one I think George Fox liked at all. But he called himself, and so let me go back to how it... Okay, here it is. he began to acquire followers and really quite significantly growing. I heard one statistic and I always like to find 3 times when it overlaps so I know I'm on the right track. I found one statistic that said by 1650, 10% of the UK was becoming Quaker by convincement. How does that sound to you, Karen? So I want to find that, so I almost hesitate to say that, but that is growing leaps and bounds. But it wasn't necessarily an organized system that he had in this growing because they were so persecuted. So the followers became known as the Children of Light, the Publishers of Truth, the Friends of Truth, and then it sort of became unified as a Society of Friends. And that might have been because that's what he called himself.
And they would call each other not Mr. or Mrs. It would be friend Abigail, friend Timothy. Because Mr. or Mrs. was still considered a lofty title. They didn't like titles.
Or brother and sister, they would refer to each other. Yeah. Yes, question.
Actually, a comment. There's an excellent book on Quakerism on Nantucket, I think by Leach, who's at least one of the authors. It's
Peter Gow. And Peter
That's
Gow.
probably,
Peter Gow, Quaker Nantucket.
yes. Either any of the
Yeah.
bookstores will probably be able to get it. It's excellent.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Yes.
Hi,
Emily.
Lisa Apperson, 20 years at Penn State. They were gathering in the valleys east of us. You mentioned that 85 to 90% stay. One of our concerns was the 10 to 15% that were leaving. Who looks after them?
Well, I think that's a great question. And also, you were at Penn State?
Yeah.
So if I'm not mistaken, Big Valley was near you. There was a very conservative older Amish group. They're
Oh,
called
yes.
the Nebraska Amish and the...
I'm driving down the highway by Aaronsburg, and there's a farmer plowing his field with 8 mules shoulder to shoulder. I stood with my jaw hanging down, watching him make the turns. Take 8 mules and get them to turn and keep the furrow straight.
I know.
Oh, and one other thing. Those buggies, they met state law. They had rear lights and turn signals with a little battery underneath the seat. Because they made code for that.
Yeah.
Obviously, there was no brake light.
Yeah. But I think you bring up an interesting point, and it's almost a conversation we could even talk afterwards about the 10 to 15% that leave the Amish. And there's certainly, most of them become Mennonites. Most of them almost go Amish light. They're still connected. They are not shunned unless they have been baptized, which is very important. And all of our churches have church discipline, so it's more haunting, to hear the word shunning. But I do think that, I don't mean to present them as a perfect society, but I think they have, 85 to 90% is a pretty satisfied group, and their story doesn't get told, but a lot of the 10 to 15% that have come out of dysfunctional families, their stories seem to be told, and everyone kind of assumes, oh, that's all the Amish. That's why I love reading the budget, because I'm reading the 85 to 90%. I'm not reading the ones. There's a lot of books about some strange stories and things like that, but
It was hard on young males.
yeah, it is. They're not educated for employment outside, but anyway, it's an interesting question. Now, I want to point out, though, in our Protestant churches today, probably between the ages of, I think, 18 to 28 maybe, less than, I think 65% are not attending church. So it's almost a flip. It's a concern not just for the Amish. There's a exodus of churches in today. We need 2 more.
I was curious, you said that a great number of Quakers are in Africa.
Yeah,
Why is that? Is that something that's not to do with missionary work?
I think it is missionary work. Yeah, and they sent missionaries to the United States from England. So in fact, when I was looking at it today, it looks like the missionaries really started that about in the 1800s, and amazing growth. There's a question back there. Yes.
Suzanne, this is a personal question, but you said your grandfather was Amish, and you
So she was asking about my own family. So my grandfather was actually Dunkard, or German Baptist, which would have been a tree. And that was, again, the Amish shun after baptism. So in his family, he was one of 11 living near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And from what I understand, they were named the Benedicts. They were a somewhat brainy family, and farming did not capture their minds. And the farmland was disappearing. So my grandfather was a school teacher, one-room schoolhouse, then went to Penn State, became a farm report journal for KDKA, first radio station out of Pittsburgh. Then you can see his path starting to diverge, but very close to his family. They're my relatives too. I've been to the family gatherings. It's really feels like I'm walking back in time sometimes when every 5 years they have a love feast, and it looks like a big circus tent and a cappella singing and the plain bonnets and clothing of my second and third cousins. But my grandfather went on to have a career at first, actually Saturday Evening Post. That's where he ended his career as the publisher. So back in Philadelphia. So that was his path. But your question is a good one. Had we been truly old order Amish, it might have been more of a acrimonious departure, but it wasn't.
Would he have been shunned?
Not the German Baptists, only the Amish shun, and only after baptism. But they hold many things in common. All of those little branches off the Anabaptist tree. They do have electricity, my cousins. They do have cars, but they have no television, no computer, no radio in the home. Very peaceful, loving. I have a sincere respect for how they yield to life circumstances and hold fast. So anyway, any other questions, or are we done?
I think we're all set.
Thank you so much. Yes.